when I was at Sydney University, I led a student revolt there in 1973, and I fought very vigorously with the then professor, Warren Hogan.
What was the student revolt about?
Over the teaching of economics.
What did you actually do? Did you just get a bunch of students and said, "Hey, we're taking"?
Oh, that's a long story. You've asked for it, haven't you? Okay. This is we were talking before you started recording about the 70s, and you know the old joke that if you remember the 60s, you can't possibly have been there. Okay. Well, it was pretty much like that. I arrived in. I'm born 53, 17, and turned 17 in 1970. Get to university, and I'm still 17 in 1971, and it's right in the middle of the Vietnam War. This is Australia, so you face conscription to fight in the Vietnam War.
Wow.
Okay, the way out was either there was a ballot, so your name went into a ballot, and if you're 1 in 5, you get drawn, and you have to go and fight in Vietnam. You could get out of it if you were doing a university degree.
Oh.
Okay, you said if you're doing a university degree, you could defer your conscription until after you're finished. Okay, but at the same time, university students were some of the major groups leading the campaign against the Vietnam War, and I turned up quite conservative when I got to university. I could understand in fighting for freedom, but why was I being conscripted to fight for freedom? Real pain. What's going on here? So I read heavily about the Vietnam War, and I finally realised that it was actually an anti-colonial war. We're on the wrong side. Okay? So that my whole politics shifted because of that. And there were huge demonstrations against the war. And at the same time, the unemployment rate in Australia, and it was lower than most of the rest of the world, but this was common across most of the planet in the Western nations. The unemployment rate in Australia when I began university was 1.5%.
Okay.
You guys are used to 4, 5. So there's no fear that being a student rebel and being a radical would stop you getting a job, And university wasn't quite free, it became free in 1973, but you didn't have to pay huge fees, okay? You didn't have to work to pay. All the shit you people have got to put up with these days just wasn't there. So what it meant was you really got heavily, and you could, and I did, get heavily engaged in politics and social life at university. It was a fabulous time to be there. Anyway, in the middle of its first year, I was a complete believer in the neoclassical vision at this stage. And then we had this brilliant lecturer called Frank Stilwell. Frank's still alive and kicking, and he's a great friend. He became professor of political economy at Sydney Uni. Anyway, he explained what's called the theory of the second best during a first-year lecture. Have you heard of that?
No.
Okay. I think it won a Nobel Prize for its developers, Kelvin Lancaster, and I've forgotten the other guy who developed it. And what it was the theory, it said, imagine you're 2 steps from the neoclassical definition of nirvana. So you like the usual story, they say monopoly is bad, and trade unions are bad. Yeah, okay. What if you got both? What if you have both employer associations, which mean employers behave collectively, and trade unions, which means workers behave collectively, rather than getting an equilibrium where the supply and demand curve cuts for demand for labour and supply of labour, rather than the equilibrium being that intersection. You got a marginal revenue curve, but you also got what's called a marginal social product curve. Now that gives you 2 different potential points of intersection. Okay? So when you have trade unions, and this is 50 years ago, so I'm going to be a bit hazy on some of the details. But the basic point was, if you have both trade unions and employer associations, then the wage will lie between where the workers are being exploited by the capitalists and the capitalists being exploited by the worker. It's a relative power thing that will determine where the wage occurs. Now, if you abolish one or the other, and let's just say for the heck of it, you abolish the trade unions, what do? Does that make social welfare better or worse? It makes it provably worse according to neoclassical theory. So if you have both trade unions and employer associations, and you want to make social welfare better, you've got to abolish them both simultaneously. I remember just sitting through that lecture and going, what? Because I'd accepted the whole idea, competition is best, and we should abolish trade unions and abolish monopolies. So, but this is ridiculous. You can't do the both at the same time. And why wasn't does my textbook teach me about this? So I grabbed the textbook. We were using both Samuelson and a book called Lancaster at the time. So I had both Samuelson and Lancaster. Flipped through them, no mention of this particular lemma. So I went down to the library after that, and I thought, what's going on? Because, this is stuff which I've had the theory explained to me by Frank. So I got the paper by Lancaster and I read it. And then I thought, this is amazing. Why was I not taught this? And I then got the latest bound copy of the Economic Journal, which I thought was the book I should look at, 1965 or 66, and I had a paper by two Marxists, Adam Baduri, and I've forgotten the other one. I thought, what are Marxists doing in the Economic Journal? And then I found a paper by Samuelson called A Summing Up. And I highly recommend reading that paper because have you heard of what are called the Cambridge controversies?
No.
My God, you guys got a lot of reading to do.
Well, we'll probably get a little reading list from you afterwards.
You get a huge reading
if we
list.
can.
The Cambridge controversies were a debate between Cambridge, UK, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, MIT, over the definition of capital. Started by Joan Robinson, but the absolute coup de grace came from Sraffa. And Samuelson got in on the neoclassical side, trying to defend the neoclassical against the criticisms from Cambridge, UK. And at one point, Samuelson made what he called he explained, you've done isoquants?
Yeah, briefly, not.
Okay. Well, this is all the crap of the theory.
Yeah.
But this side, just like we've got utility curves for individuals, isoquants are supposed to show combinations of capital and labor that lead to the same level of output. And so you can have lots of capital, very little labor, lots of labor, very little capital. They both produce the same amount of output. And Samuelson conceded that was what he called a parable. He said, it's not real. He said, what actually exists, there's a whole range of different technologies that combine capital and labor in specific ratios. But then what happens is as labor gets, capital gets cheaper, for example, then you'll switch from one technology to another. And as you switch, you get this envelope. You're drawing a whole set of lines of different slopes. And ultimately, you form an envelope which looks like an isoquant. So we just tell these students this parable. And he then rubbished Marx's theory using the transformation problem in the same paper. I think it's either Baduri or Garignani, who's Italian academics, who came back and said, well, let's look at the conditions in which you can aggregate the capital. And it showed that those straight lines weren't straight lines, they were curves. Now, that blew Samuelson out of the water. And he finally, in this paper called A Summing Up, he conceded defeat. And the final section of the paper says something like this: if all the above makes you nostalgic for the old-time parables of neoclassical theory, we must remind ourselves that scholars are not born to live an easy existence. We must respect and appraise the facts of life. And I read that and I thought, wow, he's conceded neoclassical theory is wrong. Now I know there's such a thing as neoclassical theory. Does he mention that it's in his textbook? My answer is no. Okay? So from that point on, I realized I was being lied to by the textbooks. And I ended up being a group of about 6 or 7 activist students at this stage, a guy called Greg Crow, who became a fairly serious researcher in transnational corporations, an anarchist, Richard Fields. And we used to meet with the staff, and the staff were pissed off by the progressive staff were pissed off by the conservative staff and so on. So we tried to run a conference on radical economics. That was useless. That got nobody turning up. And I was completely disillusioned by the whole thing. And then in 1972, there was an election of the Whitlam government in Australia, and that instantly ended conscription. Okay, so all the energy people were putting into the anti-war was suddenly liberated. You still had a total boom going on, so nobody was worried about whether they get a job or not. And rather than focusing on the Vietnam War and all this stuff, we turned our energies towards what we were being taught at university. And 2 academics, 2 young researchers in the philosophy department, Liz Jacka and Anne Curthoys, wanted to put on a course in the philosophy department called Philosophical Aspects of Feminist Thought. And the department was run democratically at the time. And the department voted in favor of the course, but the professor voted against it. a guy called Armstrong. He then went to the next level and got the course blocked. The staff went to the level above that and got the course approved. Then the Vice-Chancellor blocked the course. So the philosophy staff said, we're going on strike. And they then went around asking all the other departments to go on strike. Now, ultimately, 40% of the university was on strike.
Wow.
Okay, including economics.
For how long?
3 months.
Wow.
Mate, you guys, I had a ball. Okay.
70 seems so fun.
70 was a incredibly amazing experience. So this was the strike began in 73.
Yeah.
And like as soon as the staff pointed out that the philosophy students were on strike, what I thought was an apathetic bunch of economic students also voted to go on strike. And we finally had we had a meeting one day with about 400 students in it. Total population of the students was about 1,500 in the economics department, and they voted for a day of protest. We then ran this day of protest about what we're being taught in economics, anti-neoclassical, obviously. And that then led to the rest of the faculty was against the economists. Accountants couldn't stand the economists. The statisticians couldn't stand the economists. So we got all the backing from the other departments to investigate the economics department. And we had a faculty meeting over it. I was on the arts faculty, so I was president of the Arts Society, but I got invited to come along and speak in the economics faculty when the vote was taken. It was a secret ballot, and the vote in favour of investigating the department was passed by 24 votes to 14. Wow. And that investigation then led to the formation of a Department of Political Economy.
Wow.
Yeah,
you guys caused a real kerfuffle.
Yeah.
Sorry?
You caused a real kerfuffle.
Oh, shit, yeah. It was marvellous.